Today we are diving into the letter of James. James was the half-brother of Jesus. They've got the same mom, but Jesus didn't have a biological father. James did, and so half-brothers. James was a pillar in the early church. I mean, he was a primary leader of the church, specifically the church in Jerusalem, and he was also known as being a prayer warrior. Some people said that he was known as camel knees, that he was on his knees so much, pleading before the throne of God on behalf of others, that his knees looked like that of a camel's. So he was a prayer warrior. So James writes this letter, and it's important to know that he's got some primary influences. Two of his main influences were, one, his brother Jesus and the teachings of Christ, specifically the Sermon on the Mount. So if you read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and the letter of James, you're going to see a lot of overlaps, similar type teachings. But another thing that influenced James's writing style was Proverbs, the wisdom literature. And so a ton of this letter is filled with one-liners that are incredible. I like to think that if James was present today, he would be awesome at tweeting. He'd be great with 140 characters or less. So you're going to see a lot of one-liners that are easy to memorize, great to underline. Well, the book breaks up with the first chapter kind of setting the stage. And it's a chapter on suffering. It talks about how when we go through hard times, when we go through trials, they're not necessarily all bad, because they can be a way of maturing us in our faith. And so the reason why he talks about suffering is because the church in Jerusalem, the church that he led, was going through a hard time. There was a famine. They went through extreme poverty. And on top of that, because they were Jews who converted to Christianity, they were being persecuted by other Jews who didn't convert to Christianity. And James says, look, this isn't necessarily bad. God could use these trials. He can use these hard times to shape you and to help you become more like Jesus. But to do that, we've got to ask God for wisdom. And I think this is a key lesson in the first chapter. When you go through a trial, don't let your first response to be asking God for escape. God, get me out of this. Instead, let your first response be to ask for wisdom. God, don't just get me out of this, but take me through this and help me to understand what you're doing in my life to make me more like Christ. And then chapter 1 wraps up with an encouragement or a challenge or a command, if you will, to say, look, when you're going through the ringer, don't let that be an excuse to live an ungodly life. Even when times are tough, continue to speak truth, continue to serve widows and orphans, continue to seek and to pursue godliness. Well, after chapter 1, the next 4 chapters, chapters 2 through 5, are 12 small blocks of teaching. And like I said, these are great one-liners, really applicable things with not playing favoritism, things about how do we handle our wealth, things like how do we control the way we talk and our tongues, really applicable ways of what it looks like to live like Christ. So if you're asking yourself the question, what would it look like for Jesus to live my life? If he was in my shoes, if he was where I am, what would he live like? James gives you some great lessons to help you connect those dots. So I want to challenge you, as you read this letter, ask the question, what would it look like for me to apply these principles, to apply these lessons to my own life? So dive in, read it slow, and take it to heart and see if you can't figure out how to live more like Jesus through the writing of his half-brother, James.